My name is Gerald, and I'm 65 years old. 3 years ago, I lost my beloved wife Margaret to cancer, and since then, I've been living alone in the house I built with my own hands over 25 years. As a retired construction worker, that house represents everything I've worked for. Last month was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, watching my son Marcus get married. Instead, it became the day I discovered who my son really was. The day he kicked me out of his own wedding because I refused to sign over my $940,000 house to him. What happened next changed everything between us forever. Before I tell you what happened at my son's wedding, let me know where you're watching from, and hit that like button if you've ever felt unappreciated by your own family. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this story ends. I spent 40 years swinging hammers and laying bricks under the Colorado sun. Every blister on my hands, every ache in my back, it was all for one purpose: to build something lasting for my family. Margaret and we bought a small plot of land in the suburbs of Denver back in 1998. While other couples were buying ready-made houses, I insisted we build our own. Room by room, nail by nail, I constructed what would become our sanctuary. The house grew along with our dreams. 4 bedrooms because Margaret wanted a big family, though we were only blessed with Marcus. A wraparound porch where we'd sit every evening, watching the sunset paint the Rocky Mountains purple and gold. Margaret planted roses along the front walkway, and every spring they'd bloom in brilliant reds and whites, making our home the envy of the neighborhood. Marcus was 7 when we moved in. I remember him running through the empty rooms, his laughter echoing off the freshly painted walls. I taught him how to use tools in my garage workshop, showed him how to fix leaky faucets and patch drywall. Back then, he seemed fascinated by the work, always eager to help his old man with weekend projects. I put him through college, working double shifts to pay for his accounting degree at the University of Colorado. When he graduated summa cum laude, Margaret and I were so proud we could burst. Our son, the first in either of our families to get a college education. He landed a good job at a Denver accounting firm, bought himself a nice apartment downtown, and seemed to be living the American dream we'd worked so hard to give him. 3 years ago, everything changed. Margaret's diagnosis came like a lightning bolt. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months. She fought for 8, every day a gift we treasured. Marcus was supportive during her illness, visiting regularly, helping with doctor appointments. When she passed, he stood beside me at the funeral, his arm around my shoulders as we laid her to rest. After the funeral, the house felt enormous and empty. Every corner held memories of Margaret. Her reading chair by the living room window, the kitchen island where she'd roll out pie dough every Sunday, the master bedroom where we'd shared 37 years of marriage. Marcus suggested I might want to downsize, maybe move to a senior community. But I couldn't bear the thought of leaving the home we'd built together. 2 years later, Marcus introduced me to Ashley, a nurse he'd met at the hospital during one of his routine checkups. She was sweet and caring, with kind eyes and a gentle laugh that reminded me a little of Margaret. I was thrilled that my son had found someone who made him happy. When he proposed to her last Christmas, I was the first person he called. The engagement brought new energy to our small family. Ashley would come over for Sunday dinners, helping me cook Margaret's old recipes. She'd admire the craftsmanship in the house, running her fingers along the custom built-in bookcases I'd made by hand. She seemed to appreciate the love that had gone into every detail. But about 6 months before the wedding, something shifted. Marcus started bringing up financial planning more frequently. He'd mention articles he'd read about estate taxes, about the importance of transferring assets before it was too late. At first, I appreciated his concern for my future. He was an accountant after all, and I figured he knew about these things better than I did. The first real warning sign came on a rainy Tuesday evening in March. Marcus showed up at my door with a briefcase and a serious expression I'd never seen before. He'd brought coffee from my favorite shop downtown, the kind of gesture that usually meant he wanted something important. We sat at the kitchen table where I'd helped him with homework 20 years earlier. He pulled out a thick folder and spread papers across the surface Margaret used to use for her jigsaw puzzles. The documents were filled with legal terminology I didn't understand, but Marcus explained them with the patience of a teacher. He talked about something called stepped-up basis and gift tax exclusions. He showed me charts and graphs demonstrating how much money could be saved if I transferred the house to him before my death instead of leaving it as inheritance. The numbers were impressive, but something felt off about the whole presentation. 2 weeks later, Marcus brought Ashley and a man in an expensive suit to dinner. The man introduced himself as Robert Chen, Marcus's estate planning attorney. Over my homemade pot roast, they explained how transferring the house now would protect it from potential future creditors and reduce tax burdens. Ashley nodded along, adding comments about how smart Marcus was to think ahead like this. But when I asked specific questions about what would happen to me after the transfer, their answers became vague. Marcus assured me I could live in the house for as long as I wanted, that nothing would really change except the paperwork. Yet something in his tone made me uncomfortable, like he was selling me something rather than helping me. The pressure increased as spring turned to summer. Marcus would drop by unannounced, always with new articles about estate planning or horror stories about families who'd waited too long to organize their affairs. He'd point out maintenance issues around the house, suggesting I was getting too old to handle the upkeep properly. One afternoon, I returned from grocery shopping to find Marcus in my backyard with a man I didn't recognize. They were measuring the lot and taking photos of the house from different angles. When I confronted them, Marcus explained that his friend was a real estate agent helping with the property valuation for insurance purposes. But the agent's business card, which I found later, listed him as specializing in luxury home sales. That evening, Ashley called me separately. Her voice was gentle but insistent, as she explained how worried she and Marcus were about me rattling around in such a big house all alone. She painted pictures of me falling downstairs or having a medical emergency with no one around to help. She suggested that signing over the house would actually be a relief, removing the burden of maintenance and property taxes from my shoulders. The conversation left me feeling manipulated and angry. These weren't conversations about helping me, they were negotiations about acquiring my property. I began to see my son differently, noticing how his visits always seemed to have an agenda now. How he'd scan the rooms like an appraiser, rather than looking at me with the love I remembered. But I pushed down my doubts. This was my son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed for. Surely his motives were pure, even if his methods felt aggressive. I told myself that young people today were just more business-minded, more practical about financial matters than my generation. The breaking point came in late July. Marcus arrived with a folder of documents already prepared for my signature. He explained that the wedding was only a month away, and we needed to finalize the transfer beforehand to maximize the tax benefits. The papers were dense with legal language, but the bottom line was clear. I would sign over complete ownership of my house to Marcus, with a verbal agreement that I could continue living there. When I hesitated, asking for more time to review everything with my own lawyer, Marcus's demeanor changed completely. His patient explanations became sharp arguments. He accused me of not trusting him, of being stubborn and old-fashioned. For the first time in his adult life, my son raised his voice at me in anger. Ashley, who had been quiet during our exchange, finally spoke up. Her gentle nurse's voice was gone, replaced by something cold and calculated. She told me that I was being selfish, that I was jeopardizing their future together by clinging to a house I couldn't properly maintain. She said that if I really loved Marcus, I would want to help them start their marriage with financial security. The final month before the wedding became a war of wills. Marcus and Ashley tag-teamed me with daily phone calls, unexpected visits, and emotional manipulation that would have made a used car salesman proud. They brought up every sacrifice I'd ever made for Marcus, twisting my love for him into a weapon against my own judgment. Ashley's transformation was the most disturbing part. The sweet, caring woman who'd charmed me with her attention to Margaret's recipes had been replaced by someone calculating and cold. She'd arrive at my house with measuring tape, openly discussing renovation plans for after they took ownership. She talked about knocking down walls, updating the kitchen, and modernizing the bathrooms, as if Margaret's touches throughout the house were obstacles to overcome rather than memories to preserve. During one particularly heated argument, Ashley revealed more than she intended. She mentioned specific contractors they'd already contacted, detailed renovation budgets they'd prepared, and timeline for improvements that would begin immediately after the wedding. It became clear that they'd been planning this takeover for months, maybe even since their engagement. Marcus's behavior became increasingly desperate as the wedding approached. He'd arrive at my house before dawn or late at night, catching me off guard and trying to wear down my resistance through exhaustion. He brought legal documents that he claimed needed to be signed immediately for tax reasons, though when I called the IRS myself, they told me no such urgency existed. The most shocking discovery came by accident. While looking for a phone charger in Marcus's old room, which I'd kept exactly as he'd left it when he moved out, I found a folder of bank documents he'd forgotten. The papers revealed that Marcus had already taken out a significant loan, using my house as collateral he intended to provide. He'd somehow convinced a bank that the property transfer was guaranteed, and he'd borrowed against its value to pay for wedding expenses, the honeymoon, and what appeared to be several major purchases. My hands shook as I read through loan agreements for a new BMW, a Caribbean cruise, and down payments on furniture for house renovations. Marcus had spent nearly $80,000 based on the assumption that he'd own my house within weeks. The financial pressure he was under suddenly explained his increasingly frantic behavior. When I confronted him about the documents, Marcus didn't deny anything. Instead, he became angry that I'd been snooping through his personal papers. He claimed that taking out loans against the house's future value was standard financial planning, something I wouldn't understand because I'd never been sophisticated about money matters. Ashley joined the attack, suggesting that my discovery of their financial arrangements proved I didn't trust them and wasn't mentally capable of making important decisions anymore. She hinted that, if I continued to be unreasonable, they might need to explore legal options for protecting my interests against my own poor judgment. The threats weren't subtle. They'd researched elder financial abuse laws and seemed to be building a case that I was becoming mentally incompetent. They documented every instance where I'd forgotten a name or misplaced my keys, creating a narrative that I needed their protection from my own declining faculties. But I wasn't the confused old man they wanted me to be. I was angry, betrayed, and increasingly determined not to let them steal the home Margaret and I had built together. I started keeping detailed notes of our conversations, recording some of their visits on my phone and consulting with a lawyer without telling them. The lawyer, Sarah Martinez, was recommended by my neighbor and specialized in elder law. After reviewing my situation, she confirmed what I'd suspected. Marcus and Ashley were attempting to commit financial elder abuse, using emotional manipulation and false urgency to pressure me into signing away my most valuable asset. She advised me to document everything and under no circumstances sign any documents without her review. 3 days before the wedding, Marcus played his final card. He brought Ashley and both sets of parents to my house for what he called a family meeting. Sitting in my living room, surrounded by people who should have been supporting me, my son delivered an ultimatum that left me breathless with its cruelty. He said that if I didn't sign the transfer documents before the wedding ceremony, he and Ashley would have no choice but to cut contact with me permanently. He claimed that my stubborn refusal to help them was proof that I'd become selfish and bitter in my old age, unworthy of being part of their new family. Ashley's parents, who I'd only met twice before, nodded along with this assessment. They suggested that perhaps I needed professional help dealing with my grief over Margaret's death, and that my attachment to the house was unhealthy. Marcus's future mother-in-law even offered to help me find a nice assisted living facility where I'd be better cared for. As I looked around the room at these people plotting to steal my home, I realized that the son I'd raised and loved was gone. In his place sat a stranger who saw me only as an obstacle to his financial ambitions. The boy who'd once helped me plant Margaret's roses had grown into a man who would bulldoze them without a second thought. The wedding day arrived like a beautiful lie wrapped in silk and flowers. The ceremony was held at the prestigious Cherry Hills Country Club, a venue that cost more than most people's annual salary. As I adjusted my tie in the mirror that morning, I could see Margaret's picture on the dresser behind me, and I wondered what she would think of what our son had become. I'd decided to attend despite everything, clinging to a foolish hope that seeing me there would remind Marcus of the love we'd once shared. Maybe the significance of the day would soften his heart, help him remember that I was his father, not just an impediment to his financial plans. The country club was decorated with white roses and gold accents, elegant and expensive in a way that made me wonder how much of it was financed by loans against my house. Ashley looked beautiful in her designer gown, and Marcus was handsome in his tailored tuxedo, but I felt like I was watching strangers perform roles in a play I'd accidentally wandered into. During the cocktail hour, I tried to enjoy myself, making conversation with relatives I hadn't seen in years and complimenting Ashley's family on the beautiful ceremony. But even in these moments of normalcy, I could feel the tension building. Marcus and Ashley kept exchanging glances, whispering to each other, clearly planning something. The first sign of trouble came during the receiving line. As guests congratulated the happy couple, I overheard Ashley telling her college friends about their future plans. She spoke excitedly about moving into her new home, describing the house's features with an intimacy that suggested she'd already claimed it as her own. She mentioned specific rooms by their purposes in her renovation plans, not as they existed now. Marcus joined these conversations with enthusiasm that chilled me. He talked about our family home as if it were already his property, describing improvement projects and landscaping changes with the confidence of an owner. When his college roommate asked about the timeline for moving in, Marcus replied that everything would be finalized right after the honeymoon. The breaking point came during the dinner reception. Marcus stood to give his toast, thanking everyone for sharing their special day. But instead of the traditional speech about love and commitment, he turned his remarks into a public announcement about our family's financial arrangements. With his champagne glass raised and a microphone in his hand, Marcus told the assembled guests that his father had decided to transfer the family home to him and Ashley as a wedding gift. He described it as my generous contribution to their future together, painting me as a loving father eager to help his children succeed. The room erupted in applause and congratulations while I sat frozen in my chair, unable to process what was happening. Guests turned to smile at me, praising my generosity and wisdom in helping the young couple get started in life. Ashley's father stood to add his own remarks about how wonderful it was to see such family cooperation and support. I felt like I was drowning in their appreciation for something I'd never agreed to do. When the toasts ended and people began approaching me to express their admiration for my gift, I found my voice and began telling them the truth. I explained that no such transfer had taken place, that the house remained mine, and that I'd never agreed to give it away. The confusion that followed was excruciating. Guests looked back and forth between Marcus and me, trying to understand the contradiction. Some laughed awkwardly, assuming it was some kind of family joke or miscommunication. Others began to look uncomfortable, sensing the underlying conflict but not knowing how to respond. Marcus quickly approached me, his smile tight and his voice low but urgent. He suggested that we discuss this privately, away from the guests, but I was beyond caring about public appearances. The humiliation of being volunteered as generous when I'd actually been resisting their demands for months had pushed me past my breaking point. Ashley joined us, her bridal smile never wavering even as she hissed at me to stop embarrassing them in front of their friends and family. She reminded me that we were at their wedding, that this was their special day, and that whatever family disagreements we had could be resolved later in private. But I was done being manipulated and silenced. In a voice that carried across the elegant dining room, I announced that I had never agreed to transfer my house to anyone, that it would remain my property until my death, and that any claims to the contrary were false. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 wedding guests sat in stunned quiet, their champagne glasses halfway to their lips, watching a family drama unfold in real time. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions, from embarrassment to anger to something cold and calculating. That's when my son, the boy I'd raised and sacrificed for, made a choice that severed our relationship forever. Instead of apologizing for the misunderstanding or trying to smooth things over, Marcus decided to double down on his deception. In front of everyone who mattered to him, Marcus accused me of being confused and bitter, of not understanding the arrangements we'd supposedly made. He suggested that my grief over Margaret's death had affected my judgment, making me suspicious and paranoid about normal family financial planning. When I continued to protest, providing specific details about their pressure tactics and loan arrangements, Marcus made a decision that still takes my breath away. He told me that if I was going to disrupt his wedding with my confusion and negativity, I was no longer welcome at the celebration. Security officers appeared as if by magic, clearly summoned by Ashley during our confrontation. Marcus instructed them to escort me from the premises, telling the stunned guests that he was sorry they had to witness his father's unfortunate breakdown, but that they shouldn't let it spoil the celebration. As 2 security guards flanked me, preparing to walk me out of my son's wedding like a common criminal, I looked around the room one last time. Some guests averted their eyes in embarrassment. Others whispered among themselves about what they'd witnessed. A few people, including my sister Linda, who'd flown in from California, stood up as if to follow me out. The walk to the exit felt endless. Every step away from the reception hall was a step away from the son I'd loved and the relationship I'd treasured. By the time we reached the parking lot, I understood that Marcus had made his choice. Money mattered more than family. A house mattered more than his father. As I drove home alone, still wearing my wedding guest attire, I realized that my son had given me an unexpected gift. He'd shown me exactly who he was, and now I knew exactly what I needed to do about it. The drive home from the country club passed in a blur of streetlights and emotions I couldn't name. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white, and I had to pull over twice because my vision was clouded with tears of rage and heartbreak. The man who'd humiliated me in front of 300 people wasn't the son I'd raised. He was a stranger wearing Marcus's face. When I finally reached my house, the same house that had caused all this trouble, it looked different somehow. The porch light Margaret had insisted we install for safety cast everything in a warm glow, but instead of feeling welcoming, it felt like a spotlight illuminating my foolishness. How had I missed the signs of what Marcus was becoming? How had I let things get this far? I sat in my truck in the driveway for nearly an hour, staring at the home I'd built with my own hands. Every board, every nail, every coat of paint represented hours of my life, dreams Margaret and I had shared, sacrifices we'd made for our family's future. And my son was willing to destroy our relationship to possess it. That's when something crystallized inside me. The grief and humiliation began transforming into something harder and more focused. Marcus had taught me an important lesson tonight, though not the one he'd intended. He'd shown me that some people, even your own children, will take everything you give them and then demand more. But he'd also shown me that I still had power in this situation. My sister Linda called just as I was walking up the front steps. She'd left the wedding immediately after my ejection and was driving to my house. Her voice was tight with anger as she described the conversation she'd overheard after I left. Several guests had expressed shock at Marcus's behavior, questioning how a son could treat his father that way regardless of any disagreement they might have. Linda arrived within 20 minutes, still wearing her elegant blue dress but with fire in her eyes. She'd driven from California to attend her nephew's wedding, and instead she'd witnessed him publicly humiliate his father. As we sat in my kitchen, she held my hands and said something that changed everything. She told me that Margaret would be ashamed of what Marcus had become, but she'd be proud of me for standing up to him. She reminded me that I'd spent my entire adult life putting Marcus's needs before my own, and maybe it was time to start thinking about what I wanted and needed instead of what my son demanded. That night, Linda helped me make a list of everything Marcus had done over the past few months. The manipulation, the pressure tactics, the lies to the wedding guests, the loans taken against my property without permission. When we finished, we had documented a clear pattern of financial elder abuse that any court would recognize. But more importantly, we documented something else, a pattern of disrespect and entitlement that showed Marcus didn't see me as his father anymore. I was just an obstacle between him and what he wanted. The son who'd once helped me plant flowers for his mother was willing to destroy our relationship for money. The next morning, I made a series of phone calls that would change everything. The first was to my lawyer, Sarah Martinez, asking her to meet me first thing Monday morning. The second was to my bank, inquiring about changing account access and beneficiaries. The third was to my insurance company, asking about policy modifications. By the time Marcus and Ashley returned from their honeymoon 10 days later, I'd transformed from the confused, grieving widower they'd been manipulating into someone else entirely. Someone who understood that respect has to be earned, even from family members. Someone who'd learned that love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's enabling. The first sign that things had changed came when Marcus tried to use his key to enter my house. I'd had all the locks changed the day after the wedding, and I'd installed a security system that would alert me if anyone tried to access the property without permission. When he rang the doorbell, I answered through the intercom system, telling him that we could speak on the porch but he was no longer welcome inside. The conversation that followed was everything I'd expected, and nothing like what Marcus had planned. He'd come to apologize, he claimed, ready to smooth things over so we could move forward with the property transfer. He acted as if the wedding incident had been a minor misunderstanding, something we could laugh about once the dust settled. But I wasn't the same man he'd manipulated for months. I'd spent the time during his honeymoon consulting with lawyers, financial advisors, and therapists who specialized in family dynamics. I'd learned about something called financial abuse, about manipulation tactics, about the difference between helping family and enabling destructive behavior. I told Marcus that there would be no property transfer, no loans against the house, no renovation plans discussed. The house would remain mine until my death, at which point it would be disposed of according to my will. If he and Ashley had financial obligations based on assumptions about inheriting my property, those were their problems to solve. Marcus's facade cracked immediately. The apologetic son disappeared, replaced by the angry, entitled man I'd glimpsed at the wedding. He accused me of being vindictive, of punishing him for a simple misunderstanding. He claimed that Ashley's family was asking questions about the house situation, that his reputation was being damaged by my stubbornness. When manipulation didn't work, Marcus tried threats. He suggested that I was becoming mentally incompetent, that he might need to take legal action to protect my interests. He mentioned that several wedding guests had commented on my confused behavior, implying that he could build a case for guardianship if necessary. That's when I smiled and pulled out my phone. I'd recorded our entire conversation, just as my lawyer had suggested. I also had recordings of previous discussions, copies of the loan documents he'd left in his old room, and sworn statements from witnesses about the wedding incident. If he wanted to play legal games, I was prepared to win them. The look on Marcus's face when he realized he'd been outmaneuvered was something I'll never forget. For the first time in months, he understood that I wasn't the weak, grieving widower he'd been bullying. I was his father, the man who'd built a successful business with his bare hands, and I'd finally decided to fight back. The weeks following Marcus's return from his honeymoon revealed the full extent of the financial hole he'd dug for himself. Phone calls came from creditors looking for payments on loans that had been secured with promises about property he didn't own. The BMW dealership wanted their monthly payment. The travel agency that had arranged their elaborate honeymoon was demanding settlement of their outstanding balance. Ashley started showing up at my house alone, using the same gentle voice she'd employed during their courtship. She'd bring coffee and pastries, complimenting my appearance and asking about my health with what seemed like genuine concern. But I'd learned to see through the performance. Every visit had an agenda. Every compliment was designed to soften my resistance to their demands. During one of these visits, Ashley revealed more than she intended about their situation. She mentioned that Marcus was working overtime constantly, that they'd had to move into a cheaper apartment, that her parents were asking uncomfortable questions about the house situation. She painted a picture of young love struggling against financial hardship, clearly hoping to trigger my protective instincts. But instead of sympathy, I felt something closer to satisfaction, not because I enjoyed their suffering, but because I was finally seeing the natural consequences of their choices. They'd built their financial planning around stealing my property, and now they were learning what happens when theft doesn't go according to plan. The most revealing moment came when Ashley dropped her mask entirely. Frustrated by my continued refusal to help them, she stood in my kitchen and delivered a speech that would have made Margaret furious. She told me that I was a bitter, selfish old man who was ruining their lives out of spite. She said that Marcus deserved the house because he was young and productive while I was just taking up space until I died. Her words were ugly, but they were also liberating. Any lingering doubt I'd had about my decision evaporated as I listened to this woman tell me that my primary value was as a source of inheritance for her and my son. She wasn't a sweet nurse who'd fallen in love with Marcus. She was a gold digger who'd calculated the value of marrying into what she thought was a wealthy family. I asked Ashley to leave and told her not to return. When she threatened to have Marcus call me, I suggested that might not be the conversation she was expecting. Unknown to either of them, I'd been making changes to my financial situation that would surprise them both. The first change was removing Marcus as the beneficiary on all my accounts and insurance policies. Every bank visit, every phone call to insurance companies, every meeting with financial advisors was another step away from the future Marcus had planned. My sister Linda became the primary beneficiary of my life insurance, with several charities receiving the remainder of my estate. The second change was liquidating some of Margaret's jewelry and collectibles that Marcus had been eyeing for years. Margaret's engagement ring, her grandmother's china set, the antique furniture we'd collected together. All of it went to auction houses or specialized dealers. The money went directly to the American Cancer Society in Margaret's memory, ensuring it would help people instead of funding my son's lifestyle. But the most significant change was updating my will with the help of Sarah Martinez. The new document was ironclad, specifying that Marcus would receive exactly $1 from my estate, along with a letter explaining why. The house, my bank accounts, my truck, everything of value would go to people and organizations that had shown me respect and gratitude. 3 months after the wedding, Marcus made one final attempt at reconciliation. He arrived at my house on a Saturday morning, clean-shaven and carrying flowers, looking like the son I remembered from happier times. His voice was humble as he asked if we could talk, really talk, about repairing our relationship. For a moment, I wanted to believe that he'd learned something from the consequences of his actions. Maybe financial pressure had taught him to value family over money. Maybe Ashley's true nature had become clear to him. Maybe the son I'd raised was still buried somewhere under the greed and entitlement. But as we sat on the porch where Margaret used to shell peas every summer, Marcus's real agenda became clear. He wasn't there to apologize for his behavior or to rebuild our relationship. He was there because his financial situation had become desperate, and he needed my help one more time. He told me about the mounting debt, the creditors calling daily, the stress affecting his marriage. He painted himself as a victim of circumstances, someone who'd made innocent mistakes based on misunderstandings about our family's financial arrangements. He never once acknowledged the months of manipulation, the lies told to wedding guests, or the humiliation he'd subjected me to. When I didn't immediately offer to solve his problems, Marcus's facade began to crack again. He reminded me that he was my only child, my only connection to Margaret's memory, my only chance at grandchildren. He suggested that my stubbornness was hurting not just him, but the entire family legacy we'd built together. That's when I realized that Marcus still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. He thought this was about money, about property, about financial disagreements between family members. He couldn't see that he'd destroyed something much more valuable than any house. He'd destroyed the trust, respect, and love that had defined our relationship for 28 years. I told Marcus that our conversation was over and that he should leave. When he protested, demanding to know what it would take to fix things between us, I gave him an answer that clearly shocked him. I told him that some things, once broken, can't be repaired. Some choices have permanent consequences. Some relationships don't survive the revelation of who people really are underneath their masks. As I watched him walk away from my house for what I knew would be the last time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. The weight of trying to maintain a relationship with someone who saw me only as a source of money had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I was free to focus on my own life instead of managing his expectations and demands. 6 months after Marcus's wedding, I was living a completely different life. The house that had been the source of so much conflict had become a sanctuary again, filled with new memories instead of old resentments. I joined a woodworking club at the senior center, teaching younger people the construction skills I'd spent decades perfecting. Twice a week, I volunteered with Habitat for Humanity, using my experience to help other families build homes they could be proud of. Linda visited monthly, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. We'd work in Margaret's garden together, planning trips to places she'd always wanted to see. Without the constant stress of Marcus's demands and manipulation, I rediscovered interests I'd forgotten I had. Photography, hiking, cooking elaborate meals, just because I enjoyed the process. The loneliness I'd felt after Margaret's death was still there, but it had changed character. Instead of the desperate emptiness that made me vulnerable to manipulation, it was a gentler sadness balanced by genuine contentment. I missed my wife every day, but I was no longer afraid of being alone. My neighbors, people I'd lived near for decades but barely knew, became genuine friends once I stopped being consumed by family drama. Tom and Ellen from across the street invited me to their weekly poker games. Maria next door taught me to make authentic Mexican tamales. The retired teacher from the corner house and I started a small book club that met in my living room. These new relationships were based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than biological obligation or financial dependency. Nobody wanted anything from me except my company and friendship. The contrast with Marcus's behavior was stark and enlightening. The news about Marcus and Ashley came through my neighbor's network, rather than direct contact. Their marriage had lasted 8 months after the wedding, before Ashley filed for divorce. According to the gossip chain, she discovered that Marcus had hidden even more debt than she'd known about, including credit cards maxed out trying to maintain their lifestyle during the months they'd expected to inherit my house. Ashley had moved back in with her parents, while Marcus was living in a studio apartment across town. His job at the accounting firm was secure, but his reputation among our mutual acquaintances had been damaged by the wedding incident and the subsequent financial problems. Several people had mentioned to my neighbors that they'd been shocked by how he'd treated his father. I felt no satisfaction in learning about Marcus's struggles, but I felt no urge to rescue him either. The man who'd publicly humiliated me for refusing to give him my house was experiencing the natural consequences of building his life on expectations rather than effort. Every adult has to learn that lesson eventually. Some just learn it later and more painfully than others. The most significant change in my life came through an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Wong, a grief counselor Linda had insisted I see, helped me understand something crucial about my relationship with Marcus. She explained that my willingness to sacrifice everything for my son hadn't actually been helping him. It had been enabling his sense of entitlement and preventing him from developing the resilience and work ethic that make people successful. Through our sessions, I realized that the best gift I could have given Marcus was the experience of earning his own way in the world, facing his own challenges and building his own sense of accomplishment. By always rushing to solve his problems and provide for his needs, I'd actually been handicapping him for adult life. This understanding helped me make peace with my decision to cut off financial support. I wasn't being cruel or vindictive. I was finally allowing my son to grow up, even if that growth came later and more difficultly than it should have. Whether he learned from this experience or continued making the same mistakes was up to him. On the first anniversary of Margaret's death, I spent the day working in her garden and cooking her favorite meal. Instead of the crushing sadness I'd felt the year before, I experienced something closer to grateful remembrance. I could think about our life together, without the bitter overlay of family conflict that had colored everything for months. That evening, I received a letter from Marcus. Not a phone call or a surprise visit, but an actual handwritten letter delivered through the mail. It was 3 pages long, written on stationery that looked expensive, probably purchased specifically for this purpose. The letter was an apology, but not the kind I'd been expecting. Instead of asking for forgiveness or trying to justify his behavior, Marcus wrote about what he'd learned during our months of separation. He acknowledged that he'd treated me badly, that he'd been motivated by greed rather than love, and that he understood why I'd cut contact with him. He wrote about his divorce, his financial struggles, and the difficulty of rebuilding his life without the support system he'd taken for granted. But he also wrote about discovering strengths he hadn't known he possessed, about the satisfaction of paying his own bills and solving his own problems, about learning to value relationships based on respect rather than utility. The letter ended with a request that surprised me. Marcus didn't ask for money, property, or even reconciliation. He asked for the chance to prove that he'd learned from his mistakes, to demonstrate through actions rather than words that he'd become someone worthy of my respect. He said he understood if I wasn't ready for that, but he hoped that someday, somehow, we might find a way back to being father and son again. I read the letter 3 times before filing it away in Margaret's old desk. It was a good letter, probably sincere, definitely thoughtful. But words are easy to write when you're struggling and need help. The real test would be whether Marcus's actions over time would match his written sentiments. I decided not to respond immediately. If Marcus had truly learned the lessons he claimed to understand, he would be patient enough to let me process his letter without pressure. If he reverted to his old patterns of manipulation and demands, I'd know that his apology was just another strategy for getting what he wanted. For now, I was content with the life I'd built in the aftermath of his betrayal. I had my health, my home, my new friendships, and the peace that comes from no longer trying to maintain relationships with people who don't value you. Whether Marcus and I would ever repair our relationship was a question for the future. Today, I was focused on appreciating what I had rather than mourning what I'd lost. Today, as I sit on the porch Margaret and I designed together, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, I can honestly say that being kicked out of my son's wedding was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Not because I enjoyed the humiliation or the pain, but because it forced me to stop living my life according to other people's expectations and start honoring my own values. The house that caused so much conflict between Marcus and me has become a source of joy again. I've filled it with laughter from new friendships, purpose from meaningful work, and peace from finally understanding the difference between love and enabling. Every room holds memories of Margaret, but they're warm memories now, untainted by the bitterness of family conflict. I've learned that family isn't just about blood relationships or shared history. It's about respect, loyalty, and genuine care for each other's well-being. When those elements disappear, even biological connections become meaningless. The people who've become important to me over the past year are family in every way that matters, while the son I raised has chosen to be a stranger. Marcus sends a letter every few months now, updating me on his progress and reiterating his desire to rebuild our relationship. The letters are respectful and patient, suggesting that he may have learned something from the consequences of his actions. But I'm in no hurry to test that theory. Trust, once broken, is rebuilt through consistent actions over time, not through apologies or promises. Whether we ever reconcile is less important to me now than it once was. I've discovered that my happiness doesn't depend on having a relationship with someone who treated me badly, even if that person is my son. I can love Marcus from a distance while protecting myself from further manipulation or disappointment. The money I've saved by not supporting Marcus's lifestyle has gone toward causes Margaret would have supported. Cancer research, Habitat for Humanity, scholarship funds for students from working-class families. Knowing that my resources are helping people who appreciate them feels better than funding someone who saw my generosity as an entitlement. My new friends at the senior center often ask about my family, and I've learned to say that I have one child who's finding his own way in the world. It's not exactly a lie, and it's not exactly the truth, but it's a diplomatic way of avoiding discussions about painful topics. Most of them understand that families are complicated and don't push for details. The greatest gift of this experience has been learning to value myself appropriately. For too many years, I measured my worth by how much I could give to others, especially Marcus. I confused sacrifice with love, enabling with helping, and obligation with relationship. Now I understand that healthy relationships require mutual respect and reciprocal caring. Sometimes, I wonder what Margaret would think of the choices I've made. Would she approve of my cutting contact with our son? Would she understand why I changed my will? Would she support my decision to prioritize my own well-being over Marcus's financial needs? I think she would, because she loved me enough to want me to be happy and respected, even by our own child. The lessons I've learned from this experience have value beyond my specific situation. I've realized that many people, especially parents and older adults, struggle with the balance between helping family members and enabling destructive behavior. It's a difficult line to navigate, but it's crucial for maintaining both dignity and healthy relationships. I've also learned that it's never too late to change the patterns that define your life. At 65, I was able to recognize manipulation, resist pressure, and rebuild my social connections in ways that brought me genuine satisfaction. Age doesn't have to mean vulnerability or isolation if you're willing to stay engaged with life and maintain appropriate boundaries with people who would exploit your generosity. The house I built with my own hands remains mine, as it should be. It's filled with memories of the woman I loved, friendships I've cultivated, and accomplishments I'm proud of. When my time comes, it will be left to people and organizations that have earned it through respect and gratitude rather than demand and entitlement. Marcus may someday prove that he's learned from his mistakes and become worthy of a relationship with me again. If that happens, I'll be open to the possibility of reconciliation. But it will be reconciliation between equals, based on mutual respect rather than his expectations of my obligation to support him financially. For now, I'm content with the life I've chosen. I wake up each morning in a home I'm proud of, surrounded by people who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide them. I spend my days doing work that matters, helping people who appreciate my skills, and enjoying simple pleasures that money can't buy. The man who was humiliated at his son's wedding has been replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and more at peace with himself. I've learned that sometimes losing what you thought was most important helps you discover what truly matters. Family isn't about blood. It's about love, respect, and mutual support. When those things are absent, it's not family at all. It's just people who happen to share your DNA. As the sun sets behind the mountains and the first stars appear in the Colorado sky, I'm grateful for the journey that brought me to this moment. It wasn't the path I would have chosen, but it led me to a better understanding of myself and what I deserve from the relationships in my life. That understanding is worth more than any house, any amount of money, or any obligation to people who see you only as a resource to be exploited. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself, and ultimately for the people who've hurt you, is to step away and let them face the consequences of their choices. That's not cruelty, it's wisdom. That's not selfishness, it's self-respect. And that's not the end of love. It's the beginning of healthy boundaries that make real love possible. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision about cutting contact with family members who were taking advantage of you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about how you handled situations where love and self-respect seem to be in conflict. Please hit the like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family challenges and finding peace in difficult circumstances. Share this video with anyone who might be struggling with similar boundary issues in their own families. Remember, you deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of who's asking you to accept less. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you find the strength to value yourself appropriately in all your relationships.